Hi everybody, I'm standing on the side of a county road in Door County, Wisconsin, actually a couple miles from where I grew up. This might look like a typical Wisconsin farm behind me, and it is. It's so typical, this image was actually used for a stamp celebrating Wisconsin in 1998. Now, that raises a couple of questions. Why did Wisconsin get a stamp in 1998? Do other states get their own stamps? Let's dig in. So let's talk states on stamps. The Postal Service has celebrated every state at once on a few different occasions. My very first video was about some of these. In 1976, as part of the bicentennial celebration, we got a sheet with every US state flag. Later, we got a sheet with all of the state birds and flowers. We got greetings from stamps for each state. And in 2008, we got state flags again. But that's no fun. Sometimes a state wants to feel special all by itself. And ask any toddler or attention-hungry adult, there's no better occasion to make people pay attention to you than a birthday. The Citizen Stamp Advisory Committee is the group that selects the subjects for stamps, and they actually have an explicit guideline on this. Commemorative postage stamps will be issued at intervals of 50 years from the date of the state's first entry into the Union. So going back to the introduction, the stamp I showed you for Wisconsin was for their 150th anniversary of statehood in 1848. They also got this stamp in 1948 for their 100th anniversary, and by all indications, they'll get another one in 25 years for their 200th anniversary. Once every 50 years means we average about one statehood stamp a year. 2021 had Missouri, 2020 had Maine, and 2019 had Alabama. Of course, when you think about it, we had 13 states join kind of all at once after the signing of the Constitution in 1787, so the calendar of releases is not spread evenly around a 50-year cycle. We're actually at the start of a big dead period when it comes to statehood stamps. Between Missouri's release in 2021 and Arkansas's in 2036, there's only going to be one state stamp, Colorado's in 2026. After that, we'll hit a huge wave of them for the few years following. The Colorado and Arkansas stamps will also be the first times we get a third statehood stamp for any state. Colorado is on its third because it got a 75th anniversary stamp for some reason. Alaska and Hawaii have sort of gotten three, but one of each of those was an airmail stamp for the actual year they became states, 1959, not an anniversary. They also each got 25 and 50-year stamps. But if we're talking the standard 50-year increment stamps like the rule exists today, Arkansas will be the first one with three, 1936, 1986, and again 2036. That doesn't mean that all of the other states have gotten two already. The rule didn't become a rule until later. There are actually 15 states that have only gotten one so far. 13 of the 15 are the 13 original states. Like I said, it's a lot of stamps in a short time, and the post office just wasn't doing that many commemorative stamps back in the 1930s. 1788 had 8 states enter the Union, but 1938 only had 4 commemorative stamps total. It would have tripled the program that year to give them each one. A solution the post office chose in 1939 for the 4 states that entered in 1889 was to combine all 4 onto a single stamp. The 14th state with only one stamp is Utah. They didn't get one in 1946. Lynn's Stamp Yearbook says the reason for missing the 50th year of statehood is unclear, but one likely explanation is that state officials thought it was more important to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the settlement of the area, which was the following year in 1947. The 15th state on the list might not actually count, depending on who you ask. The Scott Catalog calls this 1935 stamp an advanced celebration of Michigan's statehood centenary, and some count it as the first statehood anniversary stamp. The quirk is that Michigan didn't become a state until 1837. They ratified their constitution and swore in their first governor in 1835, so it was the 100th anniversary of that, but Congress didn't approve their entry to the Union for another year and a half. There are a couple of reasons for the delay in statehood. One was slavery. Michigan would be a free state, and the South wanted to balance it by admitting Arkansas as a slave state before they let it in. There was also a weird issue of surveying and mapping. It was unclear whether a certain strip of land belonged to Michigan or Ohio, which led to the so-called Toledo War between the militias of the two sides, although there weren't any actual battles. Congress settled it by giving the strip to Ohio, but granted Michigan the Upper Peninsula, which had been planned to mostly go to Wisconsin. Anyway, the upshot is that, at this point, every state has its own stamp, and most have two. The Utah example does raise the existence of another group of stamps, which I'll discuss briefly. There are a lot of different types of anniversaries that have been celebrated that are kind of like statehoods. Like Utah, first settlements have been celebrated, like in Florida, Kentucky, Nevada, and Wisconsin. We've had colonial anniversaries, like for Massachusetts and Rhode Island. A lot of U.S. territories have had celebrations. Alaska, Hawaii, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Minnesota, Washington, and actually more than that. We've also celebrated the Louisiana Purchase 3 times. Going back to statehood stamps, the design process is basically the same as any other stamp. It's handled by the Citizen Stamp Advisory Committee. They do show a preference for having people involved who have some tie to the state, but it's not a rule. For instance, Alabama's 2019 stamp is a photo of a state park taken by a state resident, Joe Miller. Maine's 2020 stamp has a painting done by Edward Hopper, who might be more associated with New York, but he also spent a number of summers in Maine and did a lot of painting there. On the other hand, Mississippi's stamp is from 2017, based on a photograph by Lou Bope, who doesn't have personal ties to the state. He's based out of St. Louis. He just happened to do a series of photos of Delta blues musicians that the committee liked for the stamp. The committee does take design input from state officials. Now, they learned the hard way that it was a good idea to do. Leading up to 1989, both North and South Dakota ran independent design competitions for their 100th anniversary stamps, and sent their chosen winning designs to the Postal Service for consideration. The committee decided not to use any of them. For North Dakota, they went instead with this painting of an abandoned grain elevator in the middle of nowhere. A number of prominent residents spoke out against the stamp. The governor at the time, George Sinner, actually did so at the first day ceremony itself, saying, "The stamp does not represent the North Dakota of today, nor does it suggest a positive image of our future." That's not the kind of PR the Postal Service wants. So since then, the CSAC will take design ideas in advance. For Kentucky's stamp in 1992, the State Bicentennial Commission and the governor both reached out to the Postal Service to ask that "My Old Kentucky Home" be the focus of the design. Apparently the CSAC, I quote, was not exactly wildly enthusiastic about the idea, according to Jack Williams, the project manager for the stamp, but they did it anyway. Even if there's no prior input, the Postal Service will get final approval from the state's governors to avoid another North Dakota situation. The Wisconsin stamp from the intro took a few meetings and redesigns for Governor Tommy Thompson to finally approve. At one point, Thompson laid out his rules. "There are 3 C's I don't want to see on my stamp: cows, cheese, and cold. People think of Wisconsin as a cold place. I want the stamp to be warm and friendly." Another example is Ohio's 2003 stamp. The committee liked Michael Barut's simple graphic design, but knew it was unusual compared to other states' more traditional landscape photographs or paintings. They ran it by an official acting on Governor Bob Taft's behalf to check, and he said he liked it, but would prefer something more scenic, which resulted in them going with this stamp instead. If you think the old Ohio design was cool, we kind of saw something similar in a different context. Michael Barut went on to create Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign logo. The Ohio case does hit on a common vibe that a lot of states seem to go for. Like I said, there's a lot of scenic depictions of nature, or maybe a nice historical building. With that said, there isn't a standard format, and some can be quite unique. Alaska definitely went scenic, but the color scheme and the style and placement of the text is distinct. Minnesota's has an image of the Mississippi River that I think is even better than any from the mighty Mississippi sheet from last year. And some go a completely different direction, like Illinois. The exception to the discussion is, again, the 13 original states of the Union. The series from the late 1980s was thought of as a group by the CSAC, and they shared a basic design frame between all the releases. There's actually some discussion of this design applying for all statehood stamps going forward, but this was dropped even before the end of the run of the original 13. Now, I personally love statehood stamps. Granted, my day job is to be a state politics nerd, so I recognize that I'm not normal. On top of that, I also realize that statehood stamps are going to be more popular in the state depicted than anywhere else in the country. Along those lines, the Wisconsin stamp from the intro became notable. To get an idea of how, we can look at how many stamps were printed for each statehood release, starting from the second cycle that began in 1986. Somewhere around 160 million was a typical run, although we had a dip with Massachusetts and Maryland, possibly because they were released less than 2 months before the postal rate would change. We stayed around 160 million again until a dip in 1995, which bounced back the next year as the Postal Service experimented with the first self-adhesive commemorative stamps. But then, a nosedive. A couple new policies were announced for statehood stamps in 1998 with Wisconsin. First, as you can see, they would be printed in much more limited quantities. This chart actually undersells the drop. The original order was for just 16 million stamps, compared to the 160 million that Iowa got just 2 years earlier. This ended up getting doubled with a second printing due to state and collector demand, which is fairly unusual for a commemorative. The second policy had been played with starting in 1995 and was referred to as zoning. The stamp would only be distributed for sale to post offices in Wisconsin, although collectors could still get it from postal stores or the Postal Service's catalog. That policy still exists today. Sometimes. Doesn't seem to be consistent. The Postal Bulletin says that Indiana, Alabama, and Maine stamps all got automatic distribution to all post offices, but for Mississippi, Illinois, and Missouri, it says that automatic distribution was only to post offices in those states. In any case, the printing numbers never returned to pre-Wisconsin levels, and in some ways, the original run accurately predicted the future of commemorative stamps. As I've already discussed in a few different videos, the late 90s and early 2000s marked a turning point for the Postal Service, both in terms of the decline in stamp collecting and the decline in stamp and mail usage in general, thanks in large part to the internet. Missouri stamp from a couple years ago only had 18 million copies printed, but there wasn't an outcry. That's just a normal order for a commemorative stamp these days. Closing a video with a discussion of changes to the Postal Service often means a downer ending, but one good change the Postal Service has put into place is the Forever stamp. If you have a lot of state pride, you can stock up on sheets and use them for years. I've got a stack of Kansas ones now that I live in Wichita. Alternatively, you can get a bunch of the older ones for a lot cheaper and use them kind of as a decoration, along with a stamp that actually covers the postage. I found a bunch of these old Wisconsin ones on eBay for less than 10 cents a piece. I used one here for a pictorial postmark. But like I said, we've got a bit of a break until we see new statehood stamps. I am kind of excited. Will the first 13 states be a set again, or will there be more freedom in design? I'll be sure to make a video about the release. Check back in 13 years. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking it and subscribing. Beyond states, there are also a handful of cities that have gotten their own stamps. Kansas City and Annapolis are two examples.